Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Cycle 16. Now we have Dr. Mary Ruart from the International Society for Individual Liberty, also known as Liberty International now. Mary, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And I'm not alone. As you can see, we have some students here and we have a larger audience online, so we're looking forward to your talk today. I will sit aside and hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, today I'm talking about something near and dear to my heart, why liberty, not government, is a friend of the poor. And I think it's very important for us to understand this as libertarians, because if there's one question we always get, it is, won't the poor starve in a libertarian society? And of course, just the opposite is true. In fact, I would go so far as to say that government portrays itself as the friend of the poor, but is actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. It actually hurts the poor. I would go one step farther and say most of the poverty, almost all of it that we see today, is a creation of government. Now, I know that's a pretty bold statement, and I'm going to justify it for you because I think it's very important for us to understand that the developing countries are having trouble developing because of their governments, and that if the governments would step aside, they would be developed very quickly. So let's talk about that and see why I make such a bold statement. And it's also important even for the developed countries, because what's happening in the developed countries, and of course I live in the United States, so I've been able to see what's happened here, is that the United States went from quite a free country to a much less free country because government told us that liberty, while it was a wonderful thing, just didn't help the poor, protect the environment, or discourage crime and terrorism. All these are false. But back when this type of rhetoric started, in the early 1900s, most people, including libertarians, didn't have the intellectual ammunition to counter that argument. Now we do. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. There's two ways in which governments, two major ways I should say, there's more than two ways, but the two major ways that governments create poverty in the world today is refusing to recognize the property rights of individuals, especially in developing countries, and through regulations which literally push the poor out of the legal work market. And we'll talk about some specific examples. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of refusal to recognize property rights. And I'm drawing heavily here on Hernando de Soto's book, The Mystery of Capital. And I provided links to your organizers so that you can get more information about everything I'm sharing with you today. And I'm showing you this book in case you want to delve deeper into what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And basically, what it is that in the developed countries, like the United States, property rights were transferred from government to individuals in a very relatively, I should say, easy way. For example, half of the United States, the western half, was settled when the government bought that land from other governments and said, okay, you can all, anyone who wants to can go into that section and homestead the land. Homesteading meaning that you went to that land, marked your boundaries, and then either farmed or built something on that land. And that's what people did. Now, it's interesting, there was no government out there at the time. These weren't states yet. But everybody pretty much figured out what their boundaries were. And, of course, the first person who got there got the best chunk of land, and the second person had to work around those boundaries, and the third person had to work around those. And when that whole area was settled, then everyone agreed on whose boundaries were whose, maybe after a little fighting or court battle, but they did finally agree, and they took their title down to, their measurements down to a registration facility, and they all registered their deeds. And when these territories became states, the U.S. government recognized these claims as valid homesteading claims, and the property then had what we call clear title. Now, that means when you have clear title in the U.S., you can borrow against that, you can sell it, you can do, pretty much whatever you're permitted to do with something that's yours. Now, this didn't happen in the developing countries. Up to 80% of the land in developing countries is still owned by the government. Now, that doesn't mean people don't live on it. They do. And they build a little house, but they don't build anything fancy because they know they can be pushed off at any time. The government can take it back. And they do trade it. I mean, if somebody says, gee, I'd like to live in your place, and you want to move somewhere else, you might leave your little house with an exchange of a few dollars, but you can't mortgage it. And even though you're, in a sense, selling it to someone else, you're not getting anywhere near what you would get if you had clear title. So this has been a major problem for the developing world because many very poor people are living on government land, which in the developed countries would be considered homesteading and where they could get clear title. Now, once Hernando de Soto put this out in the world, it actually got picked up very quickly. And now there are several movements within the libertarian community to help people in developing worlds get clear title. And it's important because if you have settlements, say, on opposite sides of the river, and one community manages to jump through all the hoops you have to jump through and pay all the money that you have to pay to get that clear title, they get, their property values obviously go up overnight, sometimes as much as tenfold. The process is difficult. It's expensive. It's tricky. That's why many people in the developing nations aren't able to do this. But with modern technology, especially the electronic ability to electronically measure your boundaries now, this is happening more frequently. And I've included in the links that I've sent your organizers something about Liberty International's India Property Rights Project. One of our members has decided, he lives in India, he wants to make sure that the citizens there are able to get formal title to their property. And so what we do at Liberty International is we allow donations to his cause through our website. And so you can read about that in the link that your organizers have posted for you. This has been a really big deal in the last decade as more and more developing nations are starting to get formal titles to their property. But as I said, it isn't always easy. And so it's a major factor in the ability of the poor to go ahead and become, or at least attempt to become, more wealthy. So government inhibits this process by making it very difficult and not recognizing the property rights. And you might say, why do they do that? Well, they do that because as long as they own the land, they control it. And one of the things that they've done in the past is not recognize the property rights of those who live in the rainforest, for example. And so what they do, instead of recognizing the homesteading rights of the natives who live there and take care of the rainforest, they basically take a bribe from developers and let them go ahead and drive the native people off and clear the land. Obviously, this is not a good deal for the environment, and it certainly isn't a good deal for the native people. So that is one major way in which the developing countries have been inhibited from creating wealth. And obviously, it's the poor that are inhibited because they don't have the time, money, and energy to jump through all of these hoops to get clear title. So that is one major way in which governments create poverty. And it does happen in the U.S. too in a number of ways, but not in the particular way I'm describing now. Now, the other major way in which government keeps people poor is through regulations that look like they're neutral, but are actually very discriminatory against people of color, because people of color oftentimes, at least in the US, for example, are the disadvantaged. And of course, developing countries are disadvantaged, and regulations there hurt them too. Let me give you an example of that. So, John Stossel, who's you probably know about, it's a commentator in the US who's very libertarian, actually decided he would show how these regulations hurt the poor by trying to open a Frisbee concession or a Frisbee store in New York, Hong Kong, and India. So he went to Hong Kong, which is actually a very free economy, and in a few hours he had all the permissions he needed to open his Frisbee store. He also tried it in New York City. In New York City, it took him several weeks because the regulations there are more onerous. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then he went to India. And in India, the process took 5 years, and there was no guarantee that he would get the permit at the end of that time. Well, now it's very easy to see why people in heavily regulated economies have a hard time making money, especially the poor, because the poor can't wait 5 years to start their business. You know, their children are hungry now. They need to be able to do things now. And Hernando de Soto actually described this process in his 1989 book, The Other Path. Now, this book came out again in 2002 with a slightly different subtitle, and it talked about how the other path, how economy could control terrorism, and he talked about in Peru how lifting these regulations actually drove the Shining Path people out. I haven't read the other book, but this one is very informative because what it shows is that when people in developing countries come up against these regulations and find they can't work, what they end up doing is going into the black or gray market so that, you know, they are working illegally, which of course is a big challenge because they may have to bribe police officers. They may have to bribe government officials to look the other way as they do their business, and certainly that costs more than if they could simply do their business legally. Up to 80% in some countries of the economy is in the underground economy, what they call the informal economy, because people can't afford the permits. And that happened, you know, that's been happening in governments for a long time. One of the reasons that the United States had such a flux of immigration into the U.S. in the 1800s is because in Europe you had to belong to a guild if you wanted to be part of a particular profession. And sometimes to get into that guild you needed to pay a lot of money, or you had to have connections. And if you didn't have those social connections, you couldn't work in your chosen profession. So people moved to the United States and they were allowed to work. And that's why the United States became wealthy, because it allowed its poor to work, unlike other countries of the time that basically told their poor, you can't work because you, or at least not legally, because you don't have the connections, you don't have the money to buy your way in. There are always more poor people than rich people in any country. So a country that allows its poor to work virtually overnight becomes wealthy. Think about it. And that's why the United States became wealthy. Unfortunately, we haven't learned our lesson here in the U.S. What's happened is, as we've grown wealthier, the government has persuaded us that, oh, we need more regulations to protect the consumer. Now, these regulations don't actually protect the consumer. They protect the people that are already in business because they grandfather in the people who are already in business and make the new people jump through all of these regulatory hoops. For example, in the U.S., we had an influx of people who wanted to braid hair. You know, just braid hair. How hard is that? How dangerous is that? And yet, what happened when they tried to do that, and they generally were people of color, some from the Caribbean, some from the African nations, some blacks who were actually, you know, had been many generations in the U.S. They found this very intriguing, and it was very easy to set up a shop to braid hair, so they started doing that. And what they found is that the regulations shut them down, because the regulations say if you want to work with hair, you have to have a cosmetology license. And if you go to school for this license, you don't learn how to braid. You learn how to shampoo hair, how to dye it, how to cut it, none of which, of course, the braiders were doing. So they were being put out of business, and the libertarians came to the rescue. The Institute for Justice, which is a pro bono legal firm of libertarian lawyers, took on these cases, went into court in the U.S., and actually were able to roll back a number of these regulations, which is extremely important because then people can work freely. So if you're not aware of the Institute for Justice and its cases, I put a link in your organizer's mail so that they can share that with you. And it's very interesting because Institute for Justice has taken on a number of cases of other professions and really actually is changing the regulatory landscape in the U.S. Now, in developing countries, I'm not so sure that the constitutions would allow this type of legal action, but it's something to look into. And of course, it's something that is helping the U.S. retain its freedom instead of giving it up, as seems to be the norm today. Now, if you're unsure of how this would put somebody out of business, I'd like to share that with you, because I actually rented to low-income tenants for a long time. I had one lady who was doing childcare in her apartment, which was fine with me because she was, you know, taking in children from the other surrounding apartments, so there was no extra traffic. I had another tenant who was trying to sew curtains for businesses. So she would go to the store, she'd measure their windows, she'd come home with the measurements, and she would sew beautiful curtains for them and take them to the store. Again, no extra traffic, so that was fine with me. And these two women were able to pay their rent and make a living doing these things. But even though it was okay with me, it was not okay with the city government. They actually called me up and asked me to evict these poor women because, first of all, the apartments weren't zoned commercial. The regulations said you had to have an apartment that was zoned commercial. In the case of the woman doing childcare, the ceilings were not the height that it needed to be. They were 2 inches too short. And, of course, there was no way to remodel the apartment and add those 2 inches without it being ridiculously expensive. I didn't evict them. I thought that was ridiculous. I said, what do you think these poor women are going to do if you put them out of business? They said, oh, they can go on welfare. Like this was the solution. Here these women were supporting themselves. Well, I wasn't about to give in, but the poor women were hounded by the city regulators so much, they finally did. They said, I just can't take this. Every time I go out of my house, these people are here giving me a hard time. So they stopped their business and went on welfare, and more poverty was created. Now, that's a pretty aggressive way of creating poverty. Usually it's more subtle because the regulations just keep women from, or other disadvantaged people from getting started in the first place. But it's very sad, and this happens, of course, even more in the developing countries. But this isn't the only problem. There's another type of regulation that's known as the minimum wage, or sometimes the living wage, which is a little bit higher, that people lobby for, and it's really a way of discrimination. In South Africa, they called the minimum wage rate for jobs, and they set it high enough so that the workers who were black and would work for a little less than the whites couldn't negotiate anymore. So if you have to hire somebody at an inflated wage, who are you going to hire? The person that that you identify with because they're the same race, or the person who is of a different race or a different culture, or maybe not as educated? You're probably going to hire the more educated person who is more like you. So the blacks in South Africa lost their ability to negotiate a wage where they could actually get in the job market. Now, it wasn't good they were being paid less, don't get me wrong, but at least they had a job, and being paid something was being better than being paid nothing, which was their other option. This is also used in the U.S., and the Walter Williams, a black economist, actually wrote a book where he talked about some of the regulations I've talked about, and also about the minimum wage, and how the minimum wage is the most anti-black law on the books in the U.S. And that's because even though it looks colorblind, it penalizes the people who have less education and less experience, because now they can't negotiate a training wage. For example, when I was starting in school, I wanted to be a research scientist. I wanted to work in a lab, very early in my freshman year. But when you work in a laboratory, you use expensive equipment, you use expensive chemicals, usually you have to have some kind of supervision. So it's not something where you can walk in and, when you don't know anything, be productive enough to actually be paid large amounts of money. In fact, if you're not that good, the institution will be spending a lot of money on you. So I told them I'd work for free. And that was how I got my, quote, job. Now, of course, what I gained from that was experience and references. And so when I went to the next step, which was graduate school, I had references and experience that the other students didn't have. But this was actually outlawed in the U.S. Shortly after I left my undergraduate work. The regulations now insisted that people like myself be paid, and so of course all the positions dried up because nobody wanted to actually pay what would be a minimum wage and then have to put out all those chemicals and equipment and training when they weren't getting that much back. So minimum wage destroys jobs. Now, the thing is, in the U.S., I'm not sure exactly how this works in other countries, but in the U.S., after the government has disempowered the poor with minimum wage and regulations, what happens is they give them a welfare check. But sometimes the way in which this money is given doesn't really help the poor. It actually works against them. When I was renting to low-income tenants, I'd have young women, maybe 15, 16 years old, come to me and say, oh, I'm in high school, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have this child and drop out, and when I have the child, I will get a check for welfare, which will, cover my housing. And that way you can rent me an apartment, and I can become independent of my parents. So they saw this as a way to establish their own household oftentimes. And so, of course, once they have the child, they went, oh, this check isn't big enough to cover my expenses. Children are expensive. I know, I'll have a second child because then I'll get a bigger check. And I'll have a third child because I'll get an even bigger check. But in Michigan, where I was at the time, after the third child, there was no more increase in the welfare check. So what happened was, by the time these young women had had 3 children, they realized that this welfare check was going to keep them poor forever because it just wasn't big enough. And they decided they needed to go back to work. But now they had 3 children who needed child care. And unless they had a parent or some other relative who was willing to take the children during the day, it was tough for them. They didn't have a high school diploma. That entry-level job that they got isn't going to cover child care. And many of them just really couldn't handle it and stayed on welfare and were forever caught in the poverty trap. Those that had help and child care were able to stay in the workforce. Just 2 years is all they took on average, and then they were making more money than they would on welfare, and so they were able to move ahead. But without that extra help in the beginning, they had put themselves in a position, they had been tempted by the welfare check so much that they no longer really had a clear path to independence, financial independence. So even when the government does give help, it's oftentimes the wrong kind of help. Now, how does all this kind of come together? I've just shared with you how government creates poverty, which is contradictory to everything you've probably heard about what creates poverty. If you listen to the people who talk about these issues, especially for the developing world, you hear them talk about, oh, it's a matter of population density. It's a matter of resources. It's a matter of not having an influx of immigrants. But you know, really, all of that is, it's very minor, if important at all. Studies have shown pretty conclusively that it's liberty that is really what makes a country prosper. And just to give you one example of this, think of Hong Kong. In 1950, Hong Kong was a hunk of rock right at the edge of the ocean that didn't even have enough resources to have its own fresh water supply. It had to import its fresh water. And yet today, well, I should say, back in 1996, before it got turned over to China, the people there had a per capita income that rivaled that of the United States. And it had an open immigration policy. Poor people could come in, and they did, and they started with nothing, and they worked their way up. And as far as resources, as I said, Hong Kong really has very few. A lot of the developing countries have a lot of resources. Mexico has a lot of silver and other mineral resources, but and it's right next to the United States. But hey, Mexico's poor. The United States isn't. You know, it's about freedom. Look at North and South Korea. South Korea has more freedom than North Korea and is much richer. And that was true of East and West Germany before the Berlin Wall came down, and maybe some of you remember that. I'm not sure. But your parents do, and they can tell you about that. And it's not really about population density either. You know, India has a much less population density than, say, New York City or even Hong Kong, and yet it's not doing so well. Why is that? It's because freedom is what allows people to create wealth. And when the poor get an opportunity to create wealth, they usually take it, because for them, a 10% increase in income is the difference between their children starving and going to bed with full bellies. So they're very eager to take those opportunities usually. So again, I just want to recap a little bit, and then I'll open to questions, but a lot of what we hear about poverty today just isn't true. And one of the things I want to leave you with is where to get more information. Now, my book, Healing Our World, really goes into a lot of details, many more than I've been able to share with you here. And this is the 4th edition of Healing Our World, but you can actually read the 2nd edition free on my website at ruart.com in my free library. And if you want more information, I suggest you go there and look. This current edition has over 1,000 references of how liberty works in the real world. And it's not just about poverty, although, of course, that's a main theme. It's about healing the environment, discouraging terrorism and crime, and many of the other things that we all want to see and often turn to government for and get disappointed. You know, liberty actually is the only thing that can deliver everything the politicians promise us. The politicians can't do it because government can't do it. Only liberty can. And government, in general, is the antithesis of liberty. So I want to leave you with the very encouraging thought that even though we have a lot of poverty in the world today, that can change, and that can change virtually overnight. It only took Hong Kong less than 50 years to go from abject poverty to rival the per capita income of the richest nation on earth. 50 years. Not even 50 years. 46. So in your lifetime, you can see an end to poverty, or could if government would let go. We know how wealth is created. We know how poverty is created. And we know how to make sure that really virtually nobody has to go to bed hungry anymore. The thing is, we have to recognize the problem and do something about it. And that's why I assume you're here today, to find out just exactly how Liberty works to make a better world. And it does. So I will end here, and I'll open up to questions. I'm happy to share whatever I can with you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. All right, well, we have some online questions, but anybody in the audience? I'm giving first dibs to people who made it all the way here.
I actually have a question. China seems to be champion among countries to drive people out of poverty into, well, middle class, or at least better living standards. I was wondering, what's your opinion about what they are doing different from other countries, how they are succeeding so well? Because China is also not known so well about a lot of liberties from the government point of view. They are pretty restricted and pretty closed.
Yes, well, my understanding is that China has actually been experimenting with free zones. It has many of them, actually. And that's one of the things that's helping, because these free zones are getting wealthy. You know, it's kind of like little Hong Kongs in China in various places. And what the government is learning from that, of course, is that freedom works. So the Chinese government is in this place where, like, it wants to control, but it realizes if it does, its people are not going to be very well off. So it's playing with different versions of that idea. I don't know, you know, how that will end up in the future, but if China keeps moving in a libertarian direction, which it is, it's still far from free, as you well know. But because it's moving, it doesn't take much movement to really change things, and that's what's happening. So my hope is that China will keep on that path. I would love to see that. You know, China's been poor for a long time. I would love to see China really be at least economically free, and that's another thing. It's not as it's more economically free than it is in the other realms. But I think, again, I think the Chinese government is seeing things differently than they ever have. And Elise Schoolin, by the way, Ken Schoolin's wife, you heard Ken just earlier, is from China. And she goes back there quite a bit because she has a little bit of business there, and she can tell you a lot more than I can about that, and she probably has the best updates. So I do suggest you get in touch with Ken and Lee and get even more information than I'm giving you at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience here? Moment. Okay, we have a question from online. Evaldas wants to know how you distinguish good regulation from bad regulation, or would you say there are no good regulations at all?
Well, the way to recognize a good regulation, if there are any, is whether or not it's in alignment with the non-aggression principle. We haven't talked about that in this session. But, you know, the non-aggression principle is the basis for political liberty. And basically what that says is we don't initiate force, fraud, or theft against another, even through government. And if we do, which, you know, on occasion we might do it accidentally, for example, we make it right again. Now, most regulations don't follow the non-aggression principle. For example, if I want to, or let's just take these women I talked about. So these women I talked about that were making curtains or doing childcare in their apartment, they weren't initiating force, fraud, or theft against anyone. But the government was coming in And it was really initiating force against them, because if they didn't stop doing what they were doing, they could actually be thrown in jail. You know, they could be forcibly removed from their apartment. They'd have trial. They'd be found to be guilty of violating the regulations, and they could either have to have a big fine or jail time. So you see, the government was initiating force against them. So if you see a situation where somebody who's being peaceful is being prosecuted by government, then that's a violation of the non-aggression principle, and there are going to be bad consequences. And the reason there are, quote, bad consequences is because the ends you get are related to the means. So aggression is a form of war. So if you basically declare war, even in a small way, on your neighbor or your citizens, that's going to backfire, quite literally. You know, people will resist that, and there'll be problems. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, in Healing Our World, which I spoke about before, I go into great detail, step by step, how that happens with the environment, with the poor, and kind of dissect some of these regulations to show what's going on. So if you want more information, you know, get on my website and look at the 1993 version in my free library, and you'll learn more.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a question.
Say again?
Feedback. We have a question from William. He says, do you think you still need a strong government to protect property rights? Obviously, governments that take your property are bad, but do you need a strong government to stop others from taking your property?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by strong. What I've seen in the U.S. is that the government has gotten bigger and stronger. It has basically stopped becoming a protector of property rights and instead becoming a tool of special interest to take your property away. Let me give you a couple examples from the U.S. because I know many people in the developing world, or you know, a less free economy, look to the United States as an example, but the United States is actually going backwards at this point in time, as you'll learn from my explanations. Let's talk about Donald Trump, for example. You know, he's one of the presidential candidates, and the way he's been successful in business is he's used something called eminent domain in order to acquire properties very cheaply. Eminent domain is in the U.S. Constitution, and what it is it is supposed to be used only for things like roads. So, for example, if the government is building a highway and there's a couple people that don't want to sell their property, and if they don't sell their property, the road won't be able to be built or will have to go around and be very expensive, the government is authorized by our Constitution to take that property away from the individual. But they're supposed to compensate the person for its full market value. What has happened in recent times is, instead of compensating them for full market value, and instead of doing it for a road, if somebody like Donald Trump comes to the government and says, hey, I want that piece of property for the parking lot for my casino, what the government does is it goes to that property owner and says, we're going to condemn your property. And when they condemn it, basically that's a way of saying that the property can't be lived in anymore. So the people are forcibly evicted. The property isn't worth as much. It's worth about 10% of what its market value was before the condemnation. And so that's all they give the homeowner. And then they turn the property over to Donald Trump, either for free or for, you know, maybe some contributions to their campaign chest or whatever. But basically, Trump gets that property very cheaply. And the poor homeowner is out, you know, out of their home and hasn't been fully compensated. This is a perversion of what the Constitution intended. So the Institute for Justice, which I discussed with you before, actually took on some of these cases. It took on Donald Trump specifically, and actually won against him and allowed a little old lady to keep her property. And so if you go to one of his casinos, you will see her house in the middle of the parking lot, which she still loves and lives in. Now, unfortunately, another way in which property rights are violated in the U.S. is normally, if you are accused of a crime, you get tried, and then you might get fined. But what the government is doing now, and this won't sound so different from something that happens in some other countries, is that if the police even suspect or think or imagine that you have drugs in your car or you have drugs in your house, they can actually seize your property, take it, take title to it, and not give it back, even if you haven't been convicted of a crime. Because you see, in their mind, it's the property that's guilty, not you. So it doesn't matter because property has no rights, according to this doctrine. So again, Institute for Justice has been very active in showing people that this is happening, and it's happening a lot, because the police or whoever confiscate the property get a cut. So they have every reason to do so. This is a perversion of property rights in the U.S. So this is some of the kinds that you have to worry about when you have a strong government. So maybe that's a roundabout way of saying it's very difficult to believe that you can have a strong government that won't violate your property rights. So I'm thinking that a smaller government whose only role is to protect your life and liberty and property is probably closer to the ideal. Whether such a government can be kept from growing, well, that's another question.
Okay, what about the equality?
The equality?
Yes, if liberty enables more wealth creation, a lot of people say, but it also enables more inequality, and some people will get richer, some people will get poorer. The difference between the rich and the poor keeps growing. And you know, wouldn't it be nice if we all had the Scandinavian socialist model where everybody's kept more equal?
Actually, in a free economy, people are more equal, and that's because there's a large middle class in a free economy. You see, in a regulated economy, in a strong government economy, in the kind of economies you see in the developing world, there are a few rich and a lot of poor, and not a whole lot in between. In a free economy, what happens is all the people who are down here in the poor area, when they get freedom, they start working and creating wealth. So they shift over here. So if you're looking at the median income, so to speak, what you're seeing is that there's more equality in a free country. Does that mean that there might be somebody, there won't be somebody very, very rich out here and somebody very, very poor out here? Well, the actual thing, there might be somebody very, very rich out here, but there probably won't be somebody very, very poor down here. And the reason is, in a wealthy economy, the poor's share of the wealth is much greater. In other words, think about it this way. If you were a poor person, would you rather be a poor person in India or a poor person in the United States? Probably you'd want to be in the United States. Intuitively, you know you would have a better chance there, simply because there's more wealth around. So, you know, the way things happen in India is, if you are poor, you are literally on the streets. In the United States, if you can walk into the welfare office, you will get a check. So, you know, and if the welfare office wasn't there, before the welfare office was there were a lot of organizations that helped the poor. In fact, there were so many of them that some people made a living going from organization to organization and trying to get money. They were called rounders because they went around to the different organizations. And some of them lived quite well doing that. Most, of course, private organizations try to make sure that they're actually doing something in a way that helps a person. In other words, they don't just hand them money. They usually said, well, if you really are wanting a job and want to help yourself out, we're going to give you work here. You know, so clean up this area, chop this wood, and we'll give you a meal, we'll give you a bed to sleep in, you know, we'll give you a little bit of cash to go on your way. So they made sure that the person wasn't just looking for a handout. And people who, you know, back then too, people were actually kind of ashamed to go and ask for the handout. You know, during the Great Depression in the U.S., even though there was help available, a lot of people didn't take it because they felt that was, you know, that was making them, quote, a charity case, and they didn't want to be a charity case. They wanted to be known as an independent, free person. That attitude has changed in the U.S. Now it's considered to be, oh, hey, free money, yeah, let's go for it. It's a whole different way of looking at things. So the bottom line is, because of these things, you actually have more equality, true equality, in a free economy than you do in a poor economy. Because in the poor economy, the only people who have what we would consider the necessary luxuries of life are those at the very top of the heap. And, you know, in Healing Our World, part of the studies that I cite are on equality. So you can actually read the studies that show what I'm speaking about in general terms. You don't have to take my word for it, and you shouldn't. You should look at the studies yourself so that you can, you know, you can be assured that that intellectual ammunition is out there. And if I might, I'd just like to say, you know, your generation is very lucky because you have that. When I started in the 1980s talking about the libertarian ideal, there was nothing out there in the way of studies that showed that liberty works in the real world. Today, every single area that you can think of has that information. It's there for you to use, and more is coming out every day. In fact, I couldn't even keep up with it when I wrote the last edition of Healing Our World. There was too much information. I couldn't address it all. So you're very, very fortunate. You actually have real-world studies to point to.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. Any more? Or we're done. Okay, one last question.
Maybe not exactly addressing the system of talk, but generally speaking about welfare, what's your general opinion about this basic income theory and the recent fuss about it?
I had a hard time hearing that last part. Lobo, can you repeat that?
Yeah. What's your opinion about the basic income theory?
Guaranteed
income?
Guaranteed income, is that what you're asking about?
Basic income.
Yeah, I mean this experiments that
oh, yes, guaranteed minimum income.
Yes, it replaces basically welfare benefits of all kinds.
Yes, there actually have been studies which show that people with a guaranteed income are less likely to work, less likely to get a new job when they get out of work, and more likely to have a family breakup when financials get tough. And again, I reference all that in Healing Our World. This has been known for a long time. So the people who are advocating a guaranteed income or something, you know, similar to that really are setting up a system where they're going to encourage people not to work. And of course what ends up happening eventually is people say, well, why should we work to support these other people? And pretty soon you'll have a handful of people supporting most people, and that's going to break down pretty fast. That's really a recipe for disaster.
That's it for time. Thank you very much, Mary. We appreciate your thoughts and insights.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.